Hello, I'm Jessica Holmes from the National Green Infrastructure Facility at Newcastle University in the United Kingdom, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the research that we've been doing on experimental sustainable drainage systems barriers for climate adaptation and the protection of buried geo-infrastructure. Firstly, just to provide some context and justification for the research that I'm presenting today, climate change has important implications for urban environments. With climate change, we're likely to see an increase in the seasonality in the UK and elsewhere, with drier, hotter summers and wetter winters. There's also likely to be an increase in the magnitude and frequency of extreme weather events. One such effect of this is urban flooding, which is often exacerbated by decisions surrounding land use, such as the use of impermeable surfacing. That means water isn't retained in soils, but is instead transferred rapidly to drains, which can result in flash flooding. Additionally, shrink-swell movements, particularly in high plasticity clays, are exacerbated by the increased seasonality associated with climate change. Here we can see the impact that this has on railway infrastructure with track settlement, but this also affects other areas of the urban environment, including slope stability and the integrity of buried infrastructure, such as pipes and buried foundations. In order to mitigate against these effects of climate change in urban areas, we need to find sustainable solutions. Sustainable drainage system barriers can provide one such solution to these issues. So a SuDS barrier, otherwise known as a capillary barrier system, consists of a fine-grained water retention layer overlying a coarse-grained drainage layer that typically has a grain size at least 5 times that of the upper fine-grained layer. The hydraulic conductivity contrast at the interface between these two layers is sufficient usually to prevent the movement of water into the drainage layer. Instead, water is usually retained at the surface layer and builds up at that interface. Only under extreme conditions does breakthrough of the infiltrated water into the drainage layer occur. So the benefits of SuDS barriers are therefore twofold. Firstly, shrink-swell movements are reduced in the underlying materials, thereby protecting buried geo-infrastructure such as pipes and foundations. And secondly, urban flooding is also mitigated against through the retention of water in the surface layer and under extreme rainfall conditions through breakthrough into the coarse-grained layer to reduce surface runoff. The Cactus Project, which stands for Climate Adaptation Control Technology for Urban Spaces, is designed to investigate the use of SuDS barriers for mitigating the effects of climate change in urban areas. It's a multi-institutional project with partners from Durham University, Cardiff University, the University of Dundee, Queen's University Belfast, Imperial College London, Newcastle University, and the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Each of these institutions is conducting research into one aspect of SuDS barriers in order to meet the Cactus Project objectives. Some key themes that arise from the Cactus Project include investigations into suitable soil types, the impacts of wetting and drying cycles and freeze-thaw cycles, the impact of vegetation on SuDS barriers, and laboratory-based experiments and numerical modelling of SuDS barriers. At Newcastle University, our role in the Cactus Project is to implement these SuDS barriers at a field scale using recommendations from other parts of the research. And it's that we'll be focusing on today for the rest of today's presentation. In order to implement the SuDS barrier at the field scale, numerical modelling and small-scale laboratory testing was first carried out. So in this research, one-dimensional modelling was first carried out alongside small-scale column experiments in order to determine the appropriate materials and geometry for optimum performance of a SuDS barrier, as will be discussed in the following slides. Hydrous 1D is a software package for modelling water, heat and solute movement in one dimension, and it was used in this case to test the performance of a SuDS barrier under different conditions. These are the inputs used in this case, so we can assign the geometry of the barrier, which in this case is a 200mm layer of crushed concrete and a 600mm layer of topsoil, amended with 5% water treatment residual. These materials are recycled in order to improve the sustainability. The soil water characteristic curves of the material can also be input into the programme. So these are obtained through prior lab work at Durham University for the fine-grained layer and using literature-based estimates for the coarse-grained layer. And finally, rainfall data is also input. So in this case, different scenarios for the Newcastle area were used with typical rainfall conditions, including a 1 in 10-year event and a 1 in 30-year rainfall event for the Newcastle area. Here we can see the results of Hydrous modelling for a 200mm crushed concrete layer underlying a 600mm topsoil layer. Rainfall was simulated at varying rates for 6 hours on this soil profile, and we can see that under a rainfall rate of 9mm per hour, the soil profile acts as a capillary barrier and prevents breakthrough of infiltrated water, as we can see by the increase in moisture content in the soil above the capillary break layer, where we see no increase in moisture content below 600mm depth. However, for greater rates of rainfall, shown in the centre plot and the plot on the right-hand side, which show a 1 in 10 year event and a 1 in 100 year event for the Newcastle area respectively, we see that the breakthrough does occur after 6 hours, as shown by the increase in the moisture content below the capillary break layer. Because this soil profile was effective as a capillary barrier under low rainfall rates and allowed breakthrough under extreme rainfall events, this soil profile was used as a basis for the development of soil column experiments. So these are the column experiments that we're aiming to carry out. Firstly, we're aiming to test the barrier under optimum conditions with a thick water retention layer of 800mm and a 200mm crushed concrete layer. This setup will then be tested with and without a geotextile in order to assess whether a capillary break can be maintained without a geotextile, or whether wash through of fine material into the coarse-grained layer occurs. Following from this, the aim of the experiment is then to reduce the thickness of the water retention layer in order to consider the balance between SuDS barrier performance and cost effectiveness. This shows the setup of the apparatus used in the laboratory. We can test 2 columns simultaneously, each of which has a Teros 31 tensiometer inserted just above the 200mm mark in order to capture the buildup of water at the interface between the fine and coarse-grained layers. A tipping bucket flow gauge is used at the base of each column to capture the point at which breakthrough occurs. Water is then added at a constant rate of 16mm per 5 minutes, which is equivalent to a 1 in 10 year rainfall event for the Newcastle area, and all of the data is logged continually over time via a GP2 data logger. Here are some preliminary results from the column experiments showing cumulative water flow through the tipping buckets at the base of the column in the blue lines, the point at which this rises above 0mm being the point of breakthrough, and the soil suction is shown in the orange lines. This shows the results of a column with 800mm of just the water treatment residual amended topsoil and one with 200mm of crushed concrete underlying 600mm of water treatment residual amended topsoil, which was designed to act as a capillary barrier. We can see that this wasn't successful in this case, as the breakthrough occurred in the column with the capillary barrier in it before that had just the topsoil. So we can say that the results of the numerical modelling are not necessarily true to life, and although we used a soil moisture characteristic curve representative of the grain size of that material in the Hydrous modelling, it's important to know the exact characteristics. It may also be that the use of crushed concrete instead of an impermeable aggregate material was preventing the coarse layer from acting as a capillary barrier, so that's also something to consider as we move forward. Once the column experiments are complete and we have a setup that performs as a capillary barrier, we'll implement this on a larger scale using a lysimeter at the National Green Infrastructure Facility at Newcastle University, where we have a range of lysimeter experiments for research on urban drainage and on green infrastructure. This is the current plan for the lysimeter experiment, although it may change depending on the results of the laboratory tests. Essentially, we'll be testing 2 different geometries, one with an optimal thickness of the fine-grained retention layer and one with a thinner layer so that we can consider the balance between performance and cost effectiveness. The lysimeter will be fully instrumented with a range of sensors to measure moisture content and soil suction, as well as electrical resistivity tomography arrays, so that the performance of the SuDS barrier can be monitored through time in response to a range of both natural and simulated weather conditions. So to summarise, the influence of SuDS-Barriers geometry on barrier performance has been assessed via Hydrous 1D modelling, and this will be continued with the column experiments. Geosynthetic filter materials in SuDS-Barrier system have been tested, and it was found that a geotextile is necessary to maintain a capillary break. SuDS barriers can be used in urban areas to reduce flood risk and to protect underlying geo-infrastructure by minimising swell movement, and it's the intention that field-scale testing of these barrier systems will reveal the long-term performance of these barriers in response to natural weather events over several years, with the long-term aim of being able to provide industry guidance for such systems. So thank you very much for listening. I'll be more than happy to take any questions.